Hello, this is Mark Warawath. I wanted to share my own personal history lesson, if you will, on gasoline in the United States. Definitely kind of a love-hate relationship with gas-powered cars. Like all young men, teenagers in that era, I was in love with the automobile, but the gasoline and fuel crisis, the energy crisis of the 70s really derailed quite a bit of my enthusiasm and made me very cautious about depending on gasoline, depending on fossil fuels, depending on petroleum for my transportation needs, only because I saw what happened in the 70s. And it was quite a trip. I mean, it was very different from, I know we complain today, and I'm sure, I'm taping this March 29th, 2026, and I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I do know that we seem to be on the verge of another fuel crisis, another energy crisis that might rival the 70s. So I thought I would remind people, especially those who didn't live through it, right? So what was it like to live through the history of the 70s? Well, closed pumps, fuel shortages, gas stations that were only open for 2 or 3 hours a day, gas stations that would be open just long enough to empty their tanks and then wait for their next delivery. Prices that started in the 1970 to 72 timeframe at 36 cents per gallon, reliably, consistently, plus or minus a penny. It was always 36 cents, right? And then it suddenly jumps, and within a 2-year period, to 53 cents. And then within the second oil shock, which was 7 years later, it now almost doubles, more than doubles, close to triple. And then it eventually stabilizes at something that is almost exactly triple the 1972 price. You could say, so what? Yeah, I mean, imagine tripling today, going from $3 to $9 a gallon for gasoline. How would people react? That's almost exactly how people were reacting there. They were panicked, they were angry, they were frustrated. They really didn't know how to respond. And I guess part of it is, long lines, right? Hoarding is one response. Minimizing your travel weekends, streets, especially highways, were mostly empty. Some of them were completely empty. It was bizarre. People would take trains, people would take buses, people would do anything except drive, stay home for the most part. This was my first car, believe it or not. It was a hand-me-down from my stepdad who used it as a way to pay off his debt to me. I had loaned him money throughout, the early 70s. And this was his way of paying me back. The irony is, of course, I traded it in and I lost 65% of the perceived value of the car, not because necessarily of rapid depreciation, which I think most would expect a car to rapidly depreciate, but because of the fuel crisis. This car got something like 8 miles per gallon, which meant nothing in 1970. 8 miles per gallon, no problem. Eight-cylinder engine, no problem. Huge, big boat of a car, no problem. But suddenly, maybe not so suddenly, but it became quite apparent that cars like this were a problem, were a major problem. Not only were they gasoline hogs, they were largely unreliable. And, frankly, they were a symbol of a bygone era. They were a symbol of what used to be and would never truly, truly come back. Now, you could say, wait a minute, this looks a little bit like a 1990s Cadillac. And you're right, it does. And for that segment, but think about who buys those 1990s Cadillacs. These were people who were yearning for the days when these types of cars were commonplace. And frankly, people would buy a new car every couple of years. Not anymore. I mean, after this time frame, people stopped buying cars every 2 years, and then they stretched it to 5 years. And now, sitting here today in 2026, the average age of a car in the United States is closer to 14 years. We don't ship as many cars as we used to. We don't replace them as often as we used to. The good news is they're more reliable, but they're also smaller, more agile, and more fuel efficient. Um, in fact, even in my day, in the 80s, early 80s, late 70s, the Volkswagen Rabbit became the go-to car because it was fuel efficient. Some of them were diesel, and they were getting 40 or 50 miles per gallon. Um, some of these, all of them got probably better than 30 miles per gallon. So that's triple or quadruple, thus nullifying the increase in the price of gasoline. and thus addressing the issue head on. The irony is American car companies could not build this car. And it took until something like the late 80s before Saturn came out, and Saturn built a car that was roughly the right size and roughly the right fuel efficiency. But for between then, this late 70s and the mid 80s, it was wide open. The American car companies could not compete because they had uh, no equivalent car. They had to partner with Japanese car companies, and you'll see in a moment what that meant. Inflation was rampant. I mean, we talk about 3%, 4%, 5% in this day and age. How about, 7.5% in 1970? How about 12.5% in 1975? How about 15% inflation in 1980? Okay. It destroys retirements. It destroys second homes. People went from one income families to two income families. This was when some would say the middle class American dream died, or it certainly went into hibernation. Um, Planning was very difficult. A lot of stores go out of business. A lot of plans, grandiose plans, additions to the home, big vacations, sending the kids to college, that kind of stuff all gets somewhat derailed because of the high inflation rates and the loss of purchasing power. One of the things that changed is we went from full service gasoline, where you literally had an attendant cleaning your windows and fueling your car and checking your oil, to in an effort to save money, right? With to lower the price of gas by a few pennies, everything went to self-serve. So now you've got every driver pumping their own gas in the snow, in the cold, in the rain, in the heat, only because of saving a few pennies. And that was vital. I mean, a few nickels here, a few nickels there, it all adds up, especially when you're pumping 10, 20, 30 gallons of gas. The other thing that changed was speed limits, and this was very controversial, caused a lot of pain and anguish, but people went from 70 to 75 miles per hour to 55 miles per hour on all the interstates across the country, which had an impact on transit times. It had an impact on diesel trucks, fuel efficiency, all those things. This was an effort to make vehicles more efficient by driving slower. And while I think it worked, right, as soon as the gas crisis was over, we went back to 70 miles per hour. In many ways, once the fuel crisis was over, Americans had this form of lobotomy or some sort of amnesia that says, hey, um, back to normal. Things are back to normal. But actually, in truth, things never really got back to normal, right? This was the car that I drove. So that I showed you the Granville from Pontiac from the 70s. This was the 80s car, significantly smaller, four-cylinder, 2-liter engine, got about 30, 32 miles per gallon. And that's, city. It had a stick shift. It was very slow. It was very underpowered, but guess what? It was very efficient, and that's all that I cared about. This was a Dodge product, but it was built by Mitsubishi. So the Mitsubishi partnership, Japanese and American. Again, Americans could not build this car. This had to be imported from Japan. And this was how we got out of the crisis in many ways, right? By relying on fuel efficient vehicles. And this to some extent, saved the middle class from, getting financially destroyed. So that's what I have to say about that. I guess you can make whatever inferences. The electric cars in the US today didn't exist in the 80s. The truth is, though, if we had more access to them, I think people would be switching to them. And part of the reason I've always been in favor of EVs, at least the last 12 years. And before that, I was a hybrid man for 12 years. So, I've been very averse to having poor fuel efficiency, totally dependent on gasoline and fossil fuels. And with electric cars, much lower operating costs. Don't have to worry about standing in line for gasoline. Much smoother ride. I mean, there's so many wonderful things that I can say about electric vehicles. Is that going to be our salvation? Well, not if they're tariffed, I guess. Not if you're not going to be able to buy them in a cost-effective way. With that, that's my history lesson. Take care.